Today, we're going to talk about Russian logistics just a touch. It has now been 4.5 days since someone, undoubtedly the Ukrainians, did a bomb attack on the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is the bridge that connects the mainland of Russia to the southeastern point of the Crimean Peninsula. It is Russia's only reliable rail connection to the southern front. There are rail connections in the eastern part of Ukraine that do end into the west, but they all are reliant on a single transfer station up near the river at Zaporizhzhia, and so they're well within short range missile fire and rocket fire from the Ukrainians. So the Russians have not used that route because the trains kept getting blown up. Kerch, however, is completely out of the range of almost all weapons that are in play in the theater, certainly everything the Ukrainians have. And it's not until equipment on the trains gets all the way past Crimea and is actually approaching Kherson City before it comes into range of Ukrainian weapons. This has been allowing the Russians to disgorge equipment and men very close to the front lines for the last 5 months of the war. With Kerch offline, and it looks like it's going to be offline for an extended period of time, they only today removed the destroyed rail cars from the fuel train that got blown up when the bomb went off. And it looks like at least one of the tracks is warped beyond any sort of easy replacement. So replacing the tracks on the section that was completely damaged is going to be a month or two process. Undoubtedly, we also had warping and melting and re-solidification in the rebar and the concrete. So it's entirely possible, but both rail lines that go across the bridge are going to be offline for an extended period of time. But let's assume best case scenario here. Let's assume that the Russians were able to rip up the rails, put up new rails, and that there was no damage to the rebar and the structure of the bridge itself. Unlikely, but let's assume that. It's going to be about a 3-week process. In that time, the Russians need to reroute logistics. Now, there is a 2-lane section of the Kerch Bridge that is still operational, so they can still move things by truck. And there is the option of ferries operating that can go to terminals. And then, of course, there's options of going through eastern and southern Ukraine direct as opposed to going through Crimea. But none of these are good options. There's all kinds of restrictions. Ammo, men, but fuel is by far the biggest one. Fuel is bulky and it takes up a lot of weight and space in any transport medium. And a single cistern car in a truck can transport more fuel than 3 of those giant liquids transport trucks that we see on American highways, which are not what the Russians use. They use ones that are about 1/3 that size. So you're talking about a 6-to-1 ratio just in terms of the volume. And of course, those trucks use an order of magnitude more fuel to move this stuff than a train would. So you're losing a lot on the way. There's also a distance issue. Right now, most of the fuel is coming primarily from the refining and port town of Novorossiysk, which is fairly close to the eastern side of the Kerch Bridge. Otherwise, you're going to have to go to Vrenza or Samara, or if you're lucky, Belgrade, which is further away, and you then have to go through either Donetsk or Luhansk or both before going north of Mariupol into Mariupol. And now you're completely within range of multiple Ukrainian weapon systems before you can eventually do a dogleg over to Kherson. So you're talking about a trip that instead of a day by train is a week or more by a combined road rail system, because you also have to do an offloading of your train at some point. Otherwise, they're just going to blow up the cisterns. The trucks at least have the option of being able to use back roads. And then, of course, there are active insurgencies going on in almost that entire route. So one Javelin is more than enough to take out a fuel truck, and these are civilian fuel trucks because the Russians don't have a military truck fleet anymore. So a Javelin might be overkill. An RPG would be plenty. Small arms fire could do it. So you're dealing with complications here to the war effort for the Russians that are an order of magnitude more complicated than they were. And even if they started redirecting everything already, it's going to be at least another week or two before the first of those fresh supplies, rerouted supplies, ultimately make it to the front where they need to be used. Which means even in the best case scenario for the Russians here, the Ukrainians have a window of at least a couple of weeks where any equipment they destroy, any fuel tanks they destroy, cannot be replaced. And if the Ukrainians are going to make a push, now's really the time to do it. Now, if it turns out that this assessment is wrong and Kerch Bridge gets repaired in short order, then that means that the window has closed very, very quickly. But judging from the damage, that is not going to happen this month. Probably not next month either. Things are changing so quickly in Ukraine. There's been a series of breakthroughs through Russian lines north of Kherson, and as a result, it appears that the entire Russian line is crumpled. The problem is that the Russians really have nowhere to retreat to, or at least not with their gear. There are two bridges, one in Kherson and one in Nova Kakhovka, that have been damaged, so you can walk across them, but you can't take your equipment with you. You can't drive across them. And that means that the Russians are literally running for their lives, and very soon they're going to be pinned against the river, and they'll have a choice between fighting to the death, surrendering, or making a run on foot for one of those bridges to get away. Now, this would obviously be bad for the Russians in any circumstance, because this is the furthest that the Russians have gotten. Kherson is the only major city that the Russian advance has captured in 7 months. But there's an additional problem here. This is the greatest concentration of Russian forces, and it is the best troops that Russia has. So we're talking at something like 25,000 troops with the best equipment that the Russians have. And if they have to abandon that, it's a double whammy, because you're talking about the evisceration and destruction of their most capable armored and infantry and artillery formations, and the abandonment of the best equipment that they have to the Ukrainian forces. In terms of weapons transfers, this would be bigger than even what the Ukrainians got with their Kharkiv offensive and the capture of Izium last month, and it's also would be greater than everything that NATO has transferred to Ukraine so far. Now, I still believe that this is Russia's war to lose. The first year of all Russia's wars look a lot like this: bad training, bad coordination, poorly maintained equipment, and eventually they turn the corner. But if their most powerful formations dissolve in the next couple of days, it's time to start thinking about what that means for Russia as a whole. Watch Kherson closely. This could very well be where this war is decided. The news as of this morning is that the Germans have nationalized a couple of physical assets, refineries specifically that belonged to Russian state-owned oil company Rosneft, multi-billion-dollar assets. We've always known this was coming. As soon as you have the Germans and the Russians having a dispute over economics and strategy, they were going to start drawing lines, and this is one of the big ones. Now, the German strategy for dealing with the Russians going back 2 centuries has been pretty straightforward. They want to avoid a war, because wars between the Germans and the Russians are awful. They fight in Poland, they fight in Ukraine, lots of people die, the weather's horrible, the terrain is wide open, they both commit atrocities, it's just wretched. So they try to avoid it, and they do that by trying to entangle their economies so they have a vested interest in not fighting. But ultimately it doesn't work out, and they end up fighting, and it's horrible. So then they don't have to entangle again. What we're seeing now is the disentanglement and the preparing for a direct confrontation. The Germans, of course, hope it won't come to that. History suggests that hope is largely in vain. That's the bigger strategic picture. The economic picture is almost just as bold, because we have now had direct entanglement between the Europeans and the Germans for going on 30 years, and now that all becomes unwound. So the Germans have fired the starting gun with some multi-billion-dollar assets they're taking away from the Russians. Expect every single joint venture that the two sides have and lots of property on both sides to basically be unwound and returned to their national authorities. And that is the end of this phase of Russian-European integration. Don't count on it coming back anytime soon, because the demographic pictures on both sides are just atrocious. So this is where it gets real, and this is where we have a sharp severing.